I make my living knowing who owns every acre in this county. So when I was up a hollow one Saturday, surveying a timber tract, and I glanced down into the next drawer and saw my wife's car parked at a hunting cabin that wasn't supposed to mean a thing to me. I knew, before I ever pulled the deed, that I was about to find out something I could never unknow. A surveyor reads land the way other men read faces, and that little car sitting where it had no business being told me, plain as a property pin in the ground, that the lines of my whole life were about to get redrawn. I stood up on that ridge a good while, longer than I want to admit, with my instruments set up in front of me and a client's timber boundary half shot, just looking down through the glass at that car. There's a stillness up high in these hills, a quiet so deep you can hear your own blood. And in that quiet, I watched my wife's car sit at another man's cabin and felt the whole shape of my life start to come apart in my hands like wet paper. I could have driven down there. I could have rolled up that drawer and put an end to the not knowing right then. But some old, patient part of me, the surveyor part, the part my granddad built, said no. Don't react. Read the ground. Get the facts. So I packed up my instrument with hands steadier than they had any right to be. And I finished shooting my client's line, because the work was the work. And then I drove home and started doing what I do best, which is finding out exactly where the truth lies. I'm going to tell you up front how this one ends, because it's not the way these stories usually go. And I want you to stay for how I got there. The man who owned that cabin was about to lose a whole lot more than my wife, and I never once had to raise my voice, throw a punch, or do a single thing I'd be ashamed to tell my kids about. I beat him with the one thing a surveyor has that a liar never will, which is the truth on the ground, marked and measured and impossible to argue with. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell me. I genuinely want to know who's out there. And stay to the end, because the lesson I pulled out of all this is the same one my granddad taught me my first week on a survey crew. And it'll serve you whether your marriage is solid or coming apart at the seams. My name is Boyd. I'm 48 years old, and I'm a land surveyor in West Virginia. I run my own small outfit, just me and a couple of guys, and we shoot property lines and boundaries and timber tracts and mineral parcels all over these hills. The kind of country where the deeds go back 200 years, and half the boundary lines are described by a rock and a dead chestnut tree that rotted away in 1940. I find the truth in all of it. I was married to Darlene for 19 years. We have 2 kids, a girl named Katie, who's 13, and a boy named Levi, who's 10. I'm going to tell you how a man who finds the true line for a living found out his own marriage had been measured off a false one for a long, long time, and what I did about it. If you're new here, this channel is for the men who carry the load and don't say much about it. The ones who keep their word, work hard, and find out one ordinary day that the ground under their family wasn't what they thought. I'm not selling anything, and I'm not going to tell you to go burn your life down. I'm just a man who got knocked flat and got back up the right way, telling it true in case it helps the next man do the same. If that's why you're here, subscribe and stick around, because somewhere out there tonight is a man who needs to hear this. And folks like you sharing it is the only way it finds him. Let me start with the trust, because in my trade, everything starts from a known point. And you can't understand what went wrong unless you understand where we started, true. I was a provider, the way a man is supposed to be where I come from. Surveying is outdoor work, hard country work, and it doesn't keep bankers' hours. I'm out before light a lot of mornings, driving 2-track roads back into hollows where the cell signal dies, walking timber all day with a rod and a transit. And a lot of my days nobody knows exactly where I am but me and the trees, because that's the nature of it. You go where the land is. I'd come home filthy and tired and proud, with a good living to show for it. And I thought that was the whole job of a husband, to be the man who could find the line, close the deal, and keep the lights on. I want you to hold on to how much I was gone, and how little anybody questioned where I was. Because the same thing that made my work honest made my marriage easy to hide things inside of. Darlene and I started with about nothing. I was a young rodman saving up to get my own license. And she believed in me back when all I had was a transit on credit and a head full of my granddad's lessons. We built it together, the business and the life. We bought a place on a few acres up a good road, and we had Katie and then Levi. And for a lot of years we were solid, the kind of solid I'd have bet the whole county on. Darlene took a job, once the kids were both in school, at a title and abstract company in town, the kind of outfit that does the paperwork on every land deal in the county, runs the titles, handles the closings. And here's a thing you need to understand about my world. A surveyor and a title company work the same land, hand in glove. I'd done business with that company for years. I knew the owner, a fellow named Glenn, knew him to shake hands with at closings and chamber lunches. A big, smiling, important man in our little town, on every board, in every photo in the paper. The kind of man everybody called a pillar. I trusted him with my own clients' deals. That detail is going to matter. I want you to understand what kind of husband I was, because it makes what came later cut deeper, and it makes the choice I made at the end mean more. I was loyal to the bone. 19 years, and it never once crossed my mind to look at another woman. Because where I come from, a man's word is the only thing he truly owns. And I'd given mine. I thought that was enough. I thought a man who kept his vows, worked himself half to death, never raised his hand or his voice, and put a good roof over his family had done the whole job. And those things matter. They surely do. But I learned the hard and expensive way, that a woman doesn't only need a man who's faithful and works hard. She needs a man who still sees her, who still asks her about her day and actually listens to the answer, who treats her like a person he's curious about and not like a fixed point on a map he stopped checking years ago. And somewhere in all those years out in the timber, I quit checking. I quit seeing her. I was faithful, and I was steady, and I was, without ever meaning to be, gone in the one way that turned out to matter most. I'll tell you about a warning I waved off, because it's the same one I see good men miss every time. A couple of years back, Darlene started changing, the way a woman does when something's pulling at her. She got a new energy about her job, talked about how much Glenn valued her, how he relied on her, how he'd said she was the only one who really kept the place running, and I was glad. I thought, good, my wife is appreciated at work. That's a fine thing. I didn't hear what was underneath it, which was a woman who'd started feeling seen by another man in exactly the place she'd stopped feeling seen by me. A surveyor of all people should know that you keep an eye on your benchmark, that you check back to your known point regular, because if your reference moves even a little and you don't catch it, every line you shoot from then on is wrong. My benchmark was moving. I was too busy out in the timber to check back to it. Now let me tell you about a benchmark, since it's going to come up again. Everything I do starts from one. A benchmark is a known, fixed, true point, surveyed and set, and every measurement I take is only as good as that point. You set up over your benchmark, and you shoot your lines from there. And if that point is solid and true, your whole survey is solid and true. 1,000 feet out, a mile out. But if somebody's quietly moved your benchmark, or if you started from a false one without knowing, then every beautiful, careful line you've drawn since is wrong. And the worst part is, it all looks right. It closes. It looks like a good survey. You don't find out it's all off until you tie back to the real truth on the ground. My marriage looked like a good survey for years. I just hadn't tied back to the truth in a long time. So that Saturday, Darlene had told me she was going into the title company to help catch up on some inventory and filing, a thing she did sometimes on weekends. And I had a tract to shoot up in the north end of the county, a timber boundary for a client looking to sell. I was up on a ridge running my line, and I stopped to glass the lay of the land the way you do, reading the terrain. And down in the next hollow there was a hunting cabin. A nice one, tucked back where you'd never find it unless you knew it was there. And parked right out front of it was Darlene's car. Her car, that I'd know anywhere. 2 hollows and 15 miles from the title company where she swore up and down she was doing inventory. Now, another man might have told himself a story about it. But I am a surveyor, and I do not tell myself stories about what's on the ground. I deal in deeds and parcels and who owns what, every day of my life. So that evening, calm as you please, I sat down at my own computer with the county records I use for work every single day, and I found that parcel. And I pulled the deed on that cabin and the land it sat on, and the owner of record. Through a little holding company I recognized in about 2 seconds was Glenn, the pillar, my wife's boss. The big, smiling man I'd shaken hands with at a dozen closings. He owned the cabin my wife's car was parked at on a Saturday. She'd told me she was at work. I sat there a long time in the blue light of that screen with the deed up, and I made myself read every line of it, the way I'd read any deed, the metes and bounds, the chain of title, the date he'd bought it, which I noticed was right about when my wife had started lighting up over a job. A surveyor learns to let the record talk, and that record was telling me a story 2 years long, written in property transfers and parcel numbers, a story my own wife had been living while I was out finding other people's lines. I'd shaken that man's hand. I'd recommended his company to my own clients. I'd sat at his closings and trusted him with deals worth more than my house. And the whole time, he'd had a key to a cabin where my wife went on Saturdays. I want to tell you what I felt, sitting there looking at that deed, and it was not what you'd think. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was the cold, level feeling I get when a survey finally closes. When all the numbers come around and meet, and the truth of a thing snaps into place, whether you wanted it to or not. For 2 years, the lines of my life hadn't been closing right, and I hadn't known why. And now, with a deed on my screen, the survey closed. Everything that hadn't added up added up. My benchmark hadn't just moved. Another man had been standing on it. And then I did the hardest and smartest thing I have ever done, which was nothing. I closed the laptop. I did not call her. I did not drive up that hollow. I did not say one word. Because I'd learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can do with a boundary dispute is start hollering about where you think the line is before you've proved it. You don't argue the line, you survey it. You go quiet, and you gather your evidence, and you mark the truth so plain that when you finally do speak, there's nothing left to argue about. So I went to bed that night next to a woman I now knew everything about, and I started, very quietly, to survey my own marriage. I want to tell you how strange those next weeks were, because I think a lot of men are living in exactly that strangeness right now and feeling like they're losing their minds. I knew, and she didn't know I knew, and so I got up every morning and made the coffee and kissed her goodbye and drove off to find other people's lines. And I came home and asked about her day and listened to her tell me about the office, about how busy it had been, maybe even about Glenn, and I nodded and I kept my face still. And inside I was running a survey on every word she said, tying each one back to a truth I already had on my screen. It is a lonely, disciplined kind of patience, knowing the worst thing in your life and saying nothing while you do it right. But I'd spent 25 years learning that patience in the timber, where you don't get to rush the land, and it turned out that was the exact muscle I needed. The man who can wait and measure beats the man who has to react. Every single time. The signs, once I let myself read them, had all been there. Every one with an innocent answer I'd accepted because I trusted her. The weekend trips to the office that ran longer than any filing could. The phone that used to lie face up on the counter and now lived face down with a passcode, which she said was a company policy about client privacy, and I'd believed because it sounded like the kind of thing a title company would have. The new clothes, the gym, The way she'd lit up over the last 2 years that I'd been glad about, because I thought it was the job. The nights Glenn's name came up easy and warm, and the way it had lately stopped coming up at all, which I now understood was a person being careful. The mileage on her car that never quite matched the little life she described. The way she'd started taking calls out on the porch, stepping away, lowering her voice, which I'd told myself was just her being polite about work business. The way our anniversary had gotten thin, perfunctory, a card and an early night, while she found whole Saturdays for a cabin up a hollow. I'd had every number I needed for 2 years. I just hadn't run the math. Because running it meant admitting the benchmark had moved. And a man will believe almost anything to keep from facing that the ground under his marriage has shifted while he wasn't looking. I went to a lawyer that week, a sharp old country attorney named Earl who'd practiced in our courthouse for 40 years, a new West Virginia divorce law cold. And what he told me is the part I most want the men listening to hear, because it surprised me, and it might surprise you. West Virginia, he said, is not a pure, no-fault state, the way a lot of places have gone. Here, he said, fault still means something. Adultery is a ground for divorce, a real one, and more than that, in West Virginia, adultery can bar a spouse from receiving alimony altogether. He looked at me over his glasses, and he said it plain. Boyd, if you can prove she committed adultery, and prove it right, the law in this state says she may not be entitled to a dime of spousal support, no matter how the rest shakes out. And in how the marital property gets divided, which we call equitable distribution, a judge here can take the circumstances into account. The business, he said, your survey outfit, you built the core of that before her and kept it your own, and we can protect it. But that proof, he said, has to be real, not a hunch, not a car you saw from a ridge. Real, documented, the kind that holds up. You do this clean, or you don't do it at all. Then Earl gave me the rest of the rules, the same ones every good lawyer gives a wronged man, and they were rules a surveyor already lives by. Don't confront her, he said. You'll only tip her off, and she'll start hiding things and lawyering up. And worse, you might lose your temper and hand her something to use against you. Don't move out of the house, whatever you do, because the man who leaves the home looks like the man who left the marriage. Don't touch the joint accounts. Don't do anything clever with money. A judge can smell a man trying to punish his wife, and it always rebounds on him. Don't say a word to the kids. Just gather it, lawful and complete, and let the law do its slow, sure work. And whatever you do, he said, do not go have a conversation with that man at the title company, no matter how bad you want to, because nothing good has ever come from a wronged husband and the other man in the same room. I told Earl I'd been finding the truth on the ground and keeping my mouth shut about it for 25 years. This was just one more boundary, and a man doesn't argue a boundary, he surveys it. So I did it clean. On Earl's advice, I hired a licensed investigator, a quiet professional, and I let him do his job, properly and legally, and inside of 3 weeks I had it, documented, dated, airtight. The cabin, the hours, the pattern, the two of them. I never followed her myself, never put a hand on a phone that wasn't mine, never did one single thing that a judge could turn around and use against me. I built my case the way I survey a boundary, slow and exact and according to the rules, so that when I set the pins, no lawyer alive could pull them. And the whole time, I went home and I was normal. I was kind, even. I played the tired husband who didn't know, because the law moves at the speed it moves, and a man who shows his hand early loses every time. That was the hardest acting of my life. Sitting across the supper table from her being decent. But I did it, because I wasn't after a fight. I was after the truth on the ground, marked so plain nobody could argue it. I'll tell you about the night it almost came apart. because it'll show you how close these things run. There was a land closing, a real one, for an actual client of mine, scheduled at the title company, and I had to be there in person to go over the survey, and so did Glenn. I had to sit across a conference table from the man, with my wife 2 doors down at her desk, and shake his big smiling hand, and talk about easements and setbacks like it was any other Tuesday, while I had a folder at home in my truck that was going to end his whole life. And there was a moment, a long one, where he was going on about some boundary detail, smiling at me, calling me Boyd like we were old friends, and everything in me wanted to slide that folder across the table and watch the smile fall off his face. I had it in my truck. I could have done it right there. But I looked at that man, and I thought about my kids, and I thought about Earl saying, "Do it clean or don't do it at all." And I closed the folder in my mind, and I finished the closing like a professional, and I shook his hand again on the way out, and I drove away. Because a surveyor doesn't set the pin until the survey's done, and mine wasn't done yet. I'll be honest with you about how that drive home felt, because I don't want you thinking I'm made of stone. I got around the first bend out of town where nobody could see me, and I had to pull the truck over. And I sat there, gripping the wheel until my hands ached, shaking, not from fear but from the pure effort of having held it in. I had just sat in a room and been gracious to the man who'd been meeting my wife in a cabin, and I'd done it for the kids and for the case and for the long game, and it had taken everything I had. A man can do the right thing and still have it nearly tear him apart. If you're in that spot right now, sitting on what you know, smiling at people you want to throw through a wall, I want you to hear me. That control you're white-knuckling isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing you'll ever do, and it's the thing that wins. When it was done, I didn't make a scene. That's not how you win these. I had Earl file, with the evidence attached, quiet and clean and complete. And the first Darlene knew that I knew anything at all was when she was served, with a petition that laid out adultery as a ground, with documentation, and a claim that under West Virginia law barred her from alimony. She came to me white as a sheet, and there was the crying and the, "How could you do this without talking to me?" And I told her, calm as I've ever been, that I'd done exactly what she'd done for 2 years, which was handle something important without mentioning it. Except I'd done mine in the daylight, and according to the law, I didn't yell, I didn't have to. The truth was on the ground, marked and measured, and there was not one thing left for her to argue. She tried, of course, the way people do when the line comes back where they hoped it wouldn't. She said I'd been distant for years, which was true, and that she'd been lonely, which was also true. And for a moment she seemed to think those truths might somehow erase the cabin, and the Saturdays, and the 2 years of looking me in the eye and lying. I told her, quietly, that she was right, that I owned my part of the distance and always would, and that none of it gave a married woman the right to carry on with her married boss and call her husband a fool for 2 years. 2 things can be true at once. A man can have failed to see his wife, and a wife can still have done a thing there's no excusing. I'd already made my peace with my half. She was going to have to make peace with hers, and the law had just made sure she'd do it without my money in her pocket. And here's the part about the man who owned the cabin, the cascade, the thing she never saw coming because people like that never do. When a thing like this gets filed, in a county this size, it does not stay quiet. And it was not me who spread it. It was the public record and the way small towns breathe. Glenn was carrying on with an employee, a subordinate, a married woman who worked under him. And when that came to light, it was not just a scandal. It was the kind of thing that gets a man removed from the boards he sat on, that makes the bank and the business partners nervous, that a wife with her own family, money, and her own lawyer does not forgive. His marriage came apart hard and expensive. His standing in that town, the pillar, the man in every photo, that cracked and fell and did not get rebuilt. Because a small town will smile at a man to his face for years, and then drop him the instant the truth on the ground gets marked. I want to be clear that I never lifted a finger to bring any of that down on him, because that matters to me, and I think it ought to matter to you. I didn't call his wife, I didn't tip off the paper, I didn't say a word at the chamber lunch, or to the men we both did business with. I just filed the truth in a public court, the way the law provides, and stopped being the one unknowingly covering for him. Everything that fell on that man fell because of what he'd done, not because of anything I added to it. He'd set every one of those pins himself, with his own hand, over 2 years of Saturdays. I just stopped pretending they weren't there. There's a justice in that which is cleaner and heavier than anything I could have cooked up out of spite. And it has the great advantage of leaving your own hands clean and your own conscience quiet. Me. I came out of it standing. The adultery ground held, and the law did what Earl said it would, and she walked away without the spousal support she'd assumed she'd get, which is exactly what the state of West Virginia says is right when a marriage ends that way. I kept my business, free and clear, the outfit with my name on it. The kids stayed primarily with me, because I was the steady one, the present one, the one whose life wasn't coming apart. And because a judge can see plain who's been holding a home together, I didn't gut her. I didn't take $1 more than was fair and lawful. I didn't run her down to the kids, not once, because they need a mother. And a man who poisons his children to win a fight has lost the only survey that ever mattered. I just held the line, the true one, and let it fall where it fell. I won't pretend I came through without scars, and I'll own my peace, because a man always has one. I'd quit checking my benchmark. I got so proud of being the provider, so deep in the timber chasing the next job, that I left my wife alone with her own loneliness for years, and never once tied back to see how far off true we'd drifted. Her choice was hers, and carrying it on with her married boss while looking me in the eye was a cruelty all her own that I'll never excuse. But I'd stopped tending the marriage a long time before Glenn ever came smiling around. And a man who won't admit his own part in how the lines went crooked is a man who'll shoot the same bad survey twice. The thing that got me through the worst of it, though, wasn't the case or the courtroom. It was a Saturday a few weeks after she was served, when the dust was still settling and the house was raw and quiet. And my boy Levi asked me if I'd take him out on a survey with me, just to ride along. So I did. I drove that 10-year-old back into a hollow with me and let him hold the rod and read the numbers off the instrument. And he thought it was about the best day of his life. And somewhere out in that timber with my son, watching him squint into the level the way I taught him, I felt the ground come back under me. Because that, right there, was the truth on the ground that mattered. Not the deed, not the cabin, not the man who fell. A boy holding a survey rod for his dad on a clear, cold morning, in a life that was hard but honest and ours. I'd lost a marriage. I had not lost the only thing that ever really mattered. And I'd protected it by keeping my head when everything in me wanted to lose it. So here's what a tired surveyor would tell you tonight, for whatever it's worth. The line is where the line is. That's the whole truth of my trade. And it turned out to be the whole truth of the rest of it too. People will argue and wish and lie about where the boundary ought to be. They'll move the stakes in the night. They'll smile and swear the line runs where it suits them. But the line is where the line is. Set in the ground long before anybody started lying about it. And my entire job is to find that truth and mark it so plain that no liar can pretend otherwise. I didn't beat a powerful man and an unfaithful wife by being louder than them or meaner than them. I beat them by being a surveyor, by going to the truth on the ground and marking it cold, and by refusing to argue about a line I could simply prove. You do not have to win the shouting. You have to find the truth and set the pin. The truth does not need you to defend it. It only needs you to stop covering it up. And I'll tell you one more thing about benchmarks. The thing my granddad told me my first week holding a rod, because it's the part that's really for you. He said, "Son, The land doesn't lie, but a man will lie to himself about the land all day long if the truth is inconvenient. Your job isn't to be smart, it's to be honest enough to go check. Most men who get blindsided in a marriage weren't stupid. They were just unwilling to walk back to the benchmark and tie in, because they were afraid of what they'd find. Don't be that man. Check your known point. Tie back to the truth regular, in your marriage and in your life. Even when, especially when, you're afraid the numbers won't close. Because finding out you're off true while you can still fix it is a gift. And finding out years too late from a car parked at a cabin is a wound. Go check your benchmark while it's still yours to check. I've still got my outfit and my license. And I'm still out in these hills before light, finding the true line for people who need to know exactly where they stand. My kids are with me, and they're good kids. And I check my benchmarks now, in my work and in my life. Regular, the way my granddad taught me, because I learned the hard way what it costs to drift off true and not notice. The house is quieter than it was, and a great deal more honest. Levy still rides along on a survey now and then, and Katie, my 13-year-old, has started asking the kind of sharp questions that tell me she's going to be all right, that the steadiness held where it counted. I'll tell you, there were nights early on when I lay awake wondering if I'd done it too cold, too quiet, if I should have raged the way some men told me I had a right to. But every time I look at those two kids, settled and safe in a home that didn't blow up in a shouting match they'd remember the rest of their lives, I know I shot it right. They didn't lose a father to a jail cell or a bottle or a bitterness that ate him hollow. They got to keep the same steady man they always had, just in a quieter, truer house. That was the line I was really protecting the whole time, and I held it. Tell me where you're standing when you hear this, and tell me, if you glassed your own life from a high ridge today, would your lines still close? I believe more of you could find your way back to true than fear they can't. The line is where the line is. Go find your benchmark, reshoot your lines, and live by the truth on the ground, no matter who's been moving the stakes.